Karen proudly called wildlife officers on my fishing. Her face dropped when they shook my hand. Before we dive into today's story, I'd like to ask you for one small favor. Tell me where you're watching from by leaving the name of your city, state, or country in the comments below. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel and meeting viewers from around the world. Thank you for being here. Now, let's go back to the moment when this unbelievable story began. The loudest person at the lake is usually the one who knows the least about it. The first thing I noticed that morning wasn't the water. It was the smell. Fresh coffee drifted from the old enamel mug balanced on the dock beside me, while cool pine air rolled across the surface of Cedar Hollow Lake. A light mist hovered only a few feet above the water, soft enough to blur the opposite shoreline into shades of blue and silver. Somewhere behind me, a woodpecker hammered against an oak tree. Out on the water, a pair of loons called back and forth, their voices echoing across the quiet like they owned the sunrise. I'd been coming to this lake for almost 20 years, and mornings like this reminded me why I never traded this little cabin for a bigger house in town. My name is Ethan Walker. Most people around here know me as the quiet guy who spends more time studying fish than catching them. That part always makes me laugh because the truth is I rarely keep anything I reel in. For me, fishing has never been about filling a cooler. It's about understanding a lake that's become part of my life. Every ripple tells a story. Every fallen tree changes the current. Every season teaches something new if you're willing to pay attention. I checked the water temperature on the small digital reader clipped to my tackle bag. 58 degrees. Perfect for early morning smallmouth bass along the rocky shoreline. I tied on a simple green pumpkin jig, made one smooth cast toward an old submerged log, and watched the line disappear into the glassy water. The silence settled over everything again. It was exactly the kind of peace that can't be bought. Then expensive perfume floated across the dock before I heard the footsteps. Click, click, click. High heels on weathered wood. I didn't even have to turn around to know who it was. Karen Mitchell had a way of arriving that made every place feel smaller. She dressed like she was attending a country club brunch instead of walking through public shoreline at 7 in the morning. Oversized sunglasses, spotless white jacket despite the damp air, and a phone already held upright, as if every ordinary moment deserved an audience. She stopped a few yards behind me, let out one dramatic sigh, and spoke loudly enough for every cabin within earshot to hear. I knew I'd catch you eventually. I slowly reeled in my line without saying a word. Experience had taught me that silence often made people reveal far more than arguments ever could. You can't fish here, she announced. This section of the lake belongs to our community. I looked around at the weathered public dock that had stood there since long before her subdivision existed. The faded state access sign was still bolted to the cedar post less than 20 feet away. It had been there for decades. So had the public easement. Facts rarely mattered to Karen once she'd convinced herself she was right. I'm talking to you, she snapped. Didn't you hear me? I smiled politely and adjusted my tackle box. Morning. That single word seemed to irritate her even more than if I'd argued. She crossed her arms, lips tightening as she stared at my fishing license clipped neatly to the outside pocket of my vest. Don't play games with me, she said. I've watched you out here for weeks. You're taking fish from private water. The breeze carried the scent of damp cedar across the dock as another cast landed perfectly beside the old log. My line barely touched the surface before Karen laughed to herself. Fine, she said, lifting her phone. Let's settle this properly. She tapped a number with unmistakable confidence. Hello? Yes, I'd like to report someone illegally fishing on our lake. He's here right now. I want wildlife officers to come immediately. She paced slowly while speaking, making sure everyone nearby could hear every word. Two joggers slowed to watch. An older couple paused with their golden retriever near the boat ramp. Even a father helping his young son launch a kayak glanced toward us. Karen smiled wider with every passing second. She truly believed she was about to become the hero of the morning. After ending the call, she slipped her phone into her pocket and looked at me with unmistakable satisfaction. You should probably pack up while you still can, she said. I simply reached for my coffee, took another sip, and watched a small ring spread across the calm water where a bluegill had just broken the surface. Somewhere in the distance, faint but unmistakable, I heard the low hum of a state patrol truck turning onto the gravel access road. And for the first time that morning, Karen looked happier than the sunrise itself. The sound of that approaching truck carried me somewhere else for just a second, back to the first morning I ever stood on this dock with my father nearly 20 years earlier. He was the kind of man who believed a lake deserved the same respect as a church. He never rushed onto the water. He always stopped, listened to the birds, watched the wind, and reminded me that nature usually answered questions long before people did. Those lessons stayed with me long after he was gone. They shaped the person I became more than any college degree ever could. I did not grow up dreaming about trophies or record-breaking fish. I grew up fascinated by why healthy lakes stayed healthy while others slowly disappeared. That curiosity carried me through college, then graduate school, where I studied freshwater ecology and fisheries management. Eventually, I spent more than 15 years working alongside state biologists, conservation groups, and local communities restoring damaged waterways across the Midwest. Some projects lasted months. Others lasted years. We rebuilt spawning habitats, monitored invasive species, restored wetlands, and helped small towns understand that protecting fish also meant protecting drinking water, tourism, and future generations. Somewhere along the way, I realized I was happiest wearing muddy boots instead of office shoes. 3 years before that morning, I stepped away from full-time government work and opened a small environmental consulting business. The schedule gave me something I had not enjoyed in years: quiet mornings. I still worked closely with state agencies whenever they needed technical support, habitat surveys, or independent reports, but I chose my projects carefully. Cedar Hollow Lake became both my office and my sanctuary. The little cabin overlooking the eastern shoreline was never meant to impress anyone. Weathered cedar siding, a rust-colored metal roof, and a porch swing my father built with his own hands. The screen door still squeaked every time it opened because I refused to replace the old spring. Every scratch on those wooden floorboards carried a memory. My mother baking peach cobbler every July. My father cleaning fishing rods after sunset. My golden retriever Cooper sleeping beside the fireplace until old age finally caught up with him. Every season left another layer of history inside those walls. That was why I protected this lake so fiercely. Not because I believed I owned it, but because nobody truly does. We simply borrow places like this from the next generation. Karen never understood that difference. She arrived only 4 years earlier when the expensive Cedar Ridge Estate subdivision was built along the northern shoreline. The development marketed luxury lakefront living with glossy brochures showing kayaks, sunsets, and smiling families. What the brochures never mentioned was that nearly 60% of the shoreline remained public under state conservation agreements dating back decades. Public boat ramps, public fishing docks, public walking trails. The law could not have been clearer. Yet Karen behaved as though buying an expensive house had somehow purchased the entire horizon. She organized neighborhood patrols that were never officially authorized. She printed unofficial warning signs using the neighborhood logo. She regularly questioned hikers, photographers, birdwatchers, and anglers about why they were there, even when they were standing on public access. Most people simply left rather than argue. Some probably believed she represented actual authority. Others just wanted to avoid ruining their weekends. Every time someone quietly walked away, Karen became a little more convinced that she was right. I had crossed paths with her before, although I usually chose the shortest possible conversation. Last autumn, she insisted that I remove several floating fish habitat structures my volunteer team had installed after receiving every required state permit. She claimed they spoiled the view from her back deck. I calmly showed her copies of the permits. She refused to read them. Instead, she declared that neighborhood standards outweighed government paperwork. A month later, she complained that migrating geese were becoming too comfortable near the shoreline because people like me encouraged wildlife. I honestly could not tell whether she expected me to negotiate with the geese or simply apologize on their behalf. That was Karen in a nutshell. Confidence first. Facts later. Sometimes never. As I watched the faint dust rising from the gravel road beyond the trees, I could almost predict exactly how the next few minutes would unfold. Karen expected flashing lights, stern voices, and an embarrassing lecture delivered in front of everyone watching from the boat ramp. She wanted a public victory. She wanted neighbors to remember the morning she defended the lake from an outsider. The irony was almost impossible to ignore. The very officers she had called had spent years working beside people like me to keep lakes exactly like this open, healthy, and accessible for every law-abiding family who wanted to enjoy them. The state truck rolled slowly into the gravel parking area, instead of racing in with lights flashing like Karen had clearly imagined. Dust drifted through the morning sunlight before settling over the wildflowers beside the access road. The engine shut off, leaving only the sound of wind moving through the pine trees and the steady splash of tiny waves against the dock. Karen stood a little straighter, smoothing the front of her white jacket as though she were preparing to accept an award. She glanced toward the handful of neighbors who had gathered near the boat ramp and flashed the confident smile of someone already convinced the outcome favored her. I could almost see the story she planned to tell later over coffee. She had caught another rule breaker. She had protected her neighborhood. She had once again proven that nobody challenged her authority without consequences. That confidence had not appeared overnight. It had been carefully built over years of people choosing convenience over confrontation. Every unanswered accusation, every visitor who quietly packed up and left, every family that decided an argument was not worth ruining a Saturday afternoon had reinforced her belief that she represented something greater than herself. In reality, she represented little more than determination mixed with misplaced certainty. The problem was that confidence often sounds exactly like authority to people who do not know the law. Karen understood that better than anyone. She spoke slowly, quoted rules that sounded official, and carried thick folders filled with neighborhood documents that looked impressive from a distance. Most people never stopped long enough to notice those papers rarely applied to public property outside the subdivision. She counted on assumptions doing the heavy lifting. A retired couple once told me she had convinced visiting birdwatchers that photography permits were required along the shoreline. Another family packed up their picnic after she insisted children could not swim from the public beach without approval from the homeowners association. A local teenager nearly abandoned his science project after Karen claimed collecting water samples violated neighborhood regulations. Every story followed the same pattern. She spoke with absolute certainty. The other person hesitated, and the day belonged to her. The unfortunate part was that many residents inside Cedar Ridge Estates genuinely believed she was helping protect property values. They saw neat landscaping, organized meetings, and polished newsletters. They did not see the hikers who stopped returning. They did not hear the frustrated anglers who quietly chose another lake. They never noticed how many visitors left believing they had done something wrong when they had actually followed every applicable regulation. I had watched that pattern develop from a distance for years because I believed facts eventually corrected misunderstandings. Most of the time they do. Sometimes, however, certainty becomes so comfortable that facts begin to feel like personal attacks. Karen reached that point long ago. She did not hate nature. In fact, she often described herself as its greatest defender. She simply believed appreciation gave her ownership. She admired the lake from her oversized windows, enjoyed sunsets from her deck, and proudly displayed framed photographs of local wildlife inside her home during community events. Somewhere along the way, she convinced herself that preserving beauty meant deciding who deserved to experience it. That idea contradicted everything I had spent my career teaching. Healthy public lands exist because ordinary families can build memories there. A child catching a first bluegill from a weathered dock often grows into an adult willing to protect rivers, forests, and wetlands. Remove public access, and eventually people stop caring about places they are no longer allowed to enjoy. Conservation begins with connection. I looked across the calm water where sunlight now reached the opposite bank, turning the mist into ribbons of gold. A great blue heron lifted from the reeds with slow, deliberate wing beats before disappearing around the bend. Moments like that reminded me why I never allowed arguments to pull me away from the real purpose of being there. Karen mistook silence for weakness because she believed every disagreement required louder words. I had learned the opposite. Lakes reward patience. Fish reward patience. Even people sometimes reward patience, although usually much later than fish. The truck doors finally opened. Two wildlife officers stepped onto the gravel wearing green uniforms dusted from the long drive. Karen immediately raised one hand high above her shoulder and waved enthusiastically, eager to direct the investigation before anyone else could speak. She walked toward them with quick, confident strides, pointing back at me before they had taken more than a few steps from their vehicle. Her voice carried clearly across the parking area as she began explaining how she had personally caught someone violating fishing regulations on what she repeatedly called her community lake. I quietly set my coffee mug on the dock railing, secured my fishing rod beside my tackle bag, and waited while the officers listened with calm professional expressions that revealed absolutely nothing about what they were already beginning to recognize. Karen barely paused long enough to breathe before launching into a speech that sounded as though she had rehearsed it in front of a mirror. She pointed directly at me without lowering her arm, her voice rising just enough for everyone gathered near the boat ramp to hear every word. "That is the man I reported," she announced. "He has been fishing here for weeks, and he refuses to leave even after I explained that this lake belongs to our community." The taller of the two wildlife officers nodded politely without interrupting her. He carried a small field notebook in one hand, but had not written a single word. His partner slowly surveyed the dock, the shoreline, and the old weathered public access sign standing beside the gravel path. Karen seemed to mistake their silence for agreement. "I have photographs," she continued quickly, already unlocking her phone. "I have videos. I have witnesses. He ignores private property, and I believe he has been removing fish from restricted water." She swiped through dozens of pictures with dramatic determination before holding the screen toward the officers. From where I stood, I could see the images were simply photographs of me casting a fishing rod from the exact same public dock where I had stood for years. There was nothing illegal about any of them. She had unknowingly documented lawful activity with remarkable consistency. The older couple standing beside their golden retriever exchanged uncertain glances. The father, helping his son with the kayak, quietly rested one hand on the boat and stopped adjusting the life jacket. Even the joggers who had slowed earlier remained nearby, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were the gentle tapping of small waves against the dock posts and the distant buzz of cicadas beginning to wake with the rising temperature. Karen seemed energized by the growing audience. "Our homeowners association has invested a great deal into protecting this shoreline," she declared. "People cannot simply show up whenever they feel like it." Her words floated across the water, sounding strangely hollow against the old public access marker that had welcomed visitors for decades. One officer finally asked a simple question. "Ma'am, which regulation do you believe is being violated?" Karen answered immediately, as though she had been waiting for that exact moment. "Unauthorized fishing on private community water, trespassing, disturbing protected habitat, possibly harvesting wildlife without permission." She listed the accusations with complete confidence, never once checking whether any of them actually existed under state law. The younger officer glanced toward the shoreline again before calmly asking another question. "Do you own the lake?" Karen smiled. "Our neighborhood manages everything around it." It was an answer that sounded impressive without actually answering the question. The officer nodded once, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. I remained where I was, one hand resting lightly on the cork handle of my fishing rod. Years spent working around conservation officers had taught me something important. Professionals prefer facts over interruptions. Every unnecessary argument only creates more noise around the truth. Karen, however, interpreted my silence exactly the way she always did. "See," she said while turning back toward the officers. "He does not even have an explanation." I almost smiled at that. The explanation existed. It simply was not my turn to give it. A cool breeze drifted across the lake, carrying the earthy scent of wet leaves and freshwater reeds. Sunlight finally climbed above the tallest pines, sending bright reflections dancing across the surface. A small school of baitfish flashed beneath the dock before disappearing into deeper water. Even after all these years, moments like that still caught my attention. Nature continued its rhythm, completely unaware that people were arguing over lines on a map. The taller officer closed his notebook without writing anything and slowly walked toward the entrance of the dock. His boots made soft, deliberate sounds against the weathered boards. His partner followed a few steps behind, looking from the faded state access sign to my tackle bag and then back toward me. Karen folded her arms with unmistakable satisfaction. She had already imagined the ending in her mind. She expected citations, embarrassment, and a public lesson about respecting rules. She stood there wearing the confident expression of someone convinced victory was only a few steps away. I simply waited as both officers approached with calm expressions that suddenly looked far more familiar than Karen could possibly understand. The taller officer stopped about 6 feet from the edge of the dock, his eyes settling on me for only a heartbeat before the corners of his mouth lifted into a familiar smile. "Well, I will be," he said with an easy laugh. "Good morning, Ethan." Before I could answer, he stepped forward and extended his hand. I shook it the same way I had dozens of times over the years after long habitat surveys, volunteer fish counts, and restoration meetings held in muddy boots instead of conference rooms. "Good to see you again, Officer Daniels," I replied. "Looks like you drew the early shift." He chuckled. "Somebody has to enjoy the sunrise." His partner looked at me for a second, then recognition spread across his face as well. "You were at the North Fork Restoration Project last spring, were not you?" he asked. "You helped us relocate those spawning beds after the flood." "That was a busy week," I answered with a smile. "I am glad the new structures held through the winter." The younger officer nodded. "Better than we expected. The latest survey looked excellent." Behind them, complete silence settled over the boat ramp. Karen had not expected the conversation to begin that way. Her confident expression froze exactly where it had been, but now it looked uncertain, almost as though she believed she had walked into the wrong story. She cleared her throat loudly. "Excuse me," she interrupted. "I did not call you here for a reunion." Officer Daniels turned politely toward her. "Yes, ma'am. We are listening." Karen pointed at me again, although this time the gesture carried noticeably less certainty. "This man has been fishing illegally on private water." Daniels glanced at me, then at the state access sign standing only a short walk away. "Has he?" he asked calmly. "Yes," Karen insisted. "He has been doing it for weeks." The younger officer looked back toward the weathered dock, then quietly asked, "Did he threaten anyone?" "No." "Damage property?" "No." "Refused to show identification?" Karen hesitated. He ignored my instructions." Neither officer reacted. Instead, Daniels slowly walked toward the faded information board mounted beside the dock. He brushed a little dust from the corner with the sleeve of his uniform, revealing the familiar state emblem that had faded under years of sun and rain. The regulations were still posted exactly where they had always been, including public fishing hours, license requirements, catch limits, and the legal designation identifying the entire dock as state-managed public access. Daniels turned back toward the gathering crowd. "For everyone's benefit," he said in a calm, professional voice, "this is a public fishing access maintained under state jurisdiction. Anyone holding a valid fishing license may lawfully fish from this location during posted hours." His words drifted across the still morning air with none of the drama Karen had hoped for. They were simply facts. Facts spoken quietly often carry more weight than arguments shouted across a parking lot. Karen frowned. "But our neighborhood controls this shoreline." Daniels answered without raising his voice. "Your homeowners association manages private property within its recorded boundaries. Public access areas remain under state management." She immediately reached for another argument. "But everyone knows this belongs to Cedar Ridge Estates. Property ownership is determined by recorded plats and state law." Daniels replied evenly, "Not by neighborhood assumption." I remained exactly where I had been from the beginning, my fishing rod resting against the dock rail, while a light breeze carried the clean scent of freshwater across the lake. Somewhere behind the reeds, a kingfisher called before diving into the water with a sharp splash. Even the little boy standing beside the kayak seemed more interested in watching the bird than the disagreement unfolding beside him. Karen looked around at the small audience as though searching for someone willing to support her version of events. Nobody spoke. The retired couple quietly read the information board for themselves. The joggers exchanged amused smiles. The father beside the kayak gently rested one hand on his son's shoulder and whispered something that made the boy grin. Officer Daniels finally looked back at me. "Everything going well out here this morning?" "Beautiful conditions," I answered. "Water temperature is 58 degrees. Fish are holding near the submerged timber, just like last week." Daniels laughed softly. "Sounds like you know this lake as well as anyone." "I have had some good teachers," I replied. Karen stood motionless, watching the conversation unfold with growing disbelief, while the confidence she had carried onto the dock only minutes earlier seemed to disappear as quietly as the morning mist lifting from the surface of the lake. Karen opened her mouth twice before any words came out. The first attempt was nothing more than a quiet breath. The second carried far less confidence than before. "There has to be some mistake," she said, forcing a smile that looked more uncomfortable with every passing second. "I was told this entire shoreline belongs to Cedar Ridge Estates." Officer Daniels rested one hand lightly on the weathered information board beside the dock. "That misunderstanding happens more often than you might think," he replied. "Private neighborhoods can border public water, but they do not automatically acquire ownership of public access points or navigable shoreline." Karen shook her head immediately. "Our board approved signs saying this area is for residents only." Daniels exchanged a quick glance with his partner before asking a question so simple that everyone standing nearby immediately understood why it mattered. "Did your board receive authorization from the state before installing those signs?" Karen hesitated just long enough for the silence to answer before she spoke. We were protecting property values." "That is not the question I asked," Daniels answered calmly. "Were the signs approved by the state agency responsible for this access?" Karen looked away toward the parking lot instead of answering. The younger officer quietly pulled out a tablet from his vehicle and opened a digital map showing the official public land boundaries around Cedar Hollow Lake. He turned the screen so everyone could see. Bright green lines marked state-managed shoreline. Thin blue lines identified public easements extending from the parking area to the dock. Cedar Ridge Estates appeared in a separate color entirely, stopping well short of the access point where we were standing. The map matched every survey I had reviewed during restoration planning over the past several years. Facts rarely needed dramatic music. They simply needed daylight. Officer Daniels pointed to the display. "This dock, this trail, this parking area, and the surrounding shoreline remain public access under state management. The easement has existed for decades." The father beside the kayak leaned forward for a better look before quietly saying, "So anyone with a valid fishing license can be here?" "That is correct," Daniels replied. "These resources belong to the public, provided everyone follows state regulations." The little boy looked up at his father with the kind of excitement only children can produce. "Does that mean we can fish here too?" His father smiled. "Looks like we can." Hearing those words reminded me why public access mattered so much. Not because of legal victories or technical boundaries, but because one child had just learned he belonged on that dock as much as anyone else. Karen still refused to let the moment end. "But he is always here," she argued while pointing toward me again. "He acts like he owns the lake." Before I could respond, the younger officer smiled. "Actually, he usually acts like someone collecting habitat observations." He looked at me and laughed softly. "Your spawning reports from April helped us adjust this year's monitoring schedule." Daniels nodded in agreement. "The vegetation survey your team submitted also identified 2 invasive plant patches before they spread into the northern cove. That saved us weeks of field work." Several people turned toward me with surprised expressions. I felt slightly embarrassed by the attention. "It is just volunteer work," I said honestly. "A healthy lake depends on everyone paying attention." Daniels shook his head. "You always say that, but your reports have been consistently reliable for years." Karen blinked several times as though the conversation no longer made sense. Only minutes earlier she had expected officers to lecture me. Instead, they were discussing restoration projects, fish habitat, water quality, and volunteer conservation work. The story she had carefully constructed was quietly falling apart without anyone raising their voice. A cool breeze rippled across the lake, carrying the scent of fresh water and sun-warmed pine needles. The mist had completely disappeared now, revealing families launching small boats farther down the shoreline. An elderly man carrying a tackle box waved toward Officer Daniels before continuing onto another public dock. Everything about the morning suddenly felt normal again, except for the uncomfortable silence surrounding Karen. Daniels finally looked directly at her with the same calm professionalism he had maintained from the beginning. "Ma'am, I appreciate citizens reporting concerns about wildlife or conservation violations. We encourage that. However, it is equally important to understand where public authority begins and ends. Public access cannot be restricted by private organizations without legal authorization." Karen lowered her eyes toward the weathered boards beneath her feet. For the first time since she stepped onto the dock that morning, she had nothing left to argue with because every answer now rested on records, maps, and laws that had existed long before either of us ever arrived at Cedar Hollow Lake. Officer Daniels did not rush to leave after the misunderstanding had been cleared up. Instead, he slowly looked around the shoreline with the careful attention of someone whose job required noticing details other people walked past every day. His eyes paused on a weathered wooden post standing near the edge of the parking lot. Bolted to it was a polished aluminum sign that read, "Residents only. Private lake access. Unauthorized entry prohibited." I had noticed it weeks earlier, but assumed the state would eventually address it during routine inspections. Daniels walked toward the sign without saying a word. The younger officer followed, comparing the location on his tablet with the official easement map still displayed on the screen. Karen remained several steps behind them, her posture noticeably different now. Gone was the confident stride she had arrived with that morning. She watched quietly as Daniels examined the mounting bolts, photographed the sign from several angles, then measured its location relative to the public access marker installed by the state years before. The younger officer looked back at the map once more before speaking. "This sign is inside the public easement." Daniels nodded slowly. "That is what I thought." He turned toward Karen with the same calm tone he had maintained from the beginning. "Ma'am, do you know who authorized this installation?" Karen hesitated before answering. "Our homeowners association approved it during a board meeting." "Did the state approve it?" Daniels asked again. Karen looked down at the gravel. "I do not know." The answer hung in the air longer than any argument had all morning. Daniels wrote several notes into his field notebook for the first time since arriving. Public access signage cannot be altered or contradicted without authorization. We will need to document this. The younger officer walked a little farther along the shoreline and quietly called back. "There is another one near the kayak launch." I remembered seeing that sign too. Then another came to mind near the Western Trail entrance. Suddenly the pattern became obvious. One sign could have been a misunderstanding. Several signs placed throughout public access areas suggested something much more deliberate. Daniels asked another question. "Have there been any complaints from visitors about being told to leave?" Before Karen could answer, the retired gentleman standing beside the golden retriever politely raised his hand. "Actually, yes," he said. "My wife and I stopped coming here last summer because we were told only homeowners could use this dock." The father beside the kayak spoke next. "We drove to another lake twice because we thought this place had become private." One of the joggers stepped forward. "My sister came here to photograph birds in the spring. Someone told her she was trespassing." Nobody sounded angry. They simply shared their experiences one after another, each story fitting together like pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered across several seasons. Daniels listened carefully without interrupting anyone. The younger officer recorded locations, dates, and general descriptions in his tablet. I remained near the dock, quietly watching the morning unfold in a direction none of us had expected when Karen made that phone call. The breeze carried the clean smell of cedar and fresh water while sunlight sparkled across the lake as if nothing unusual had happened. A pair of children laughed from a nearby canoe. Somewhere farther down the shoreline, someone cast a fishing line, the familiar whistle of braided line slicing gently through the air before disappearing into the water. Life at the lake continued exactly as it always had. Daniels finally closed his notebook and looked toward the small gathering. "We appreciate everyone speaking up. Public lands belong to everyone who follows the law. When visitors are discouraged from using legal access, that creates confusion we have a responsibility to address." His words were measured, respectful, and completely free of accusation. They did not need to be stronger than that because the evidence now spoke for itself. Karen looked as though she wanted to explain everything at once, but every explanation seemed to dissolve before reaching her lips. The confidence that had fueled every earlier accusation had quietly given way to uncertainty. Daniels thanked each witness for their time before turning back toward me. "Ethan, if you happen to have photographs showing when these signs first appeared, they may help establish a timeline." I nodded. "I believe I do. I document shoreline conditions during seasonal habitat surveys, so the signs are probably visible in several archived photographs." Daniel smiled. "That would be very helpful." I realized then that the morning was no longer about proving I had the right to fish. It had become something much more important. The conversation had shifted from one person's assumptions to protecting public access for every family, every child, every angler, every hiker, and every visitor who would arrive long after we were all gone. By the time the wildlife officers pulled away later that morning, the lake had returned to its familiar rhythm, but the story was far from over. 3 days later, my phone rang while I was repairing an old wooden nesting platform for ospreys behind the cabin. The fresh scent of cut cedar filled the workshop as I wiped sawdust from my hands and answered the call. Officer Daniels was on the other end. "Ethan, I wanted to let you know we completed the preliminary inspection." His voice carried the same calm professionalism I had heard at the dock. "You were right about the additional signs." I leaned against my workbench and listened quietly. Over the previous 48 hours, the department had documented every unauthorized sign placed within the public easement. They compared current photographs with archived survey records, reviewed state property maps, and inspected every official access point around Cedar Hollow Lake. What they found painted a picture much larger than one uncomfortable conversation on a dock. Several public entrances had been marked with unofficial restrictions that directly contradicted state regulations. Visitors had been discouraged from using areas specifically protected for public recreation. Even more concerning, some signs displayed language that closely resembled official government notices despite having no legal authorization whatsoever. The findings were forwarded to the appropriate state land management office for administrative review. Daniels never used dramatic language. He did not need to. Facts carried enough weight on their own. During the following week, state employees arrived with survey equipment, measuring wheels, cameras, and thick folders containing historical easement records dating back decades. Bright orange survey flags appeared beside trails that many residents had assumed belonged exclusively to the subdivision. Wooden stakes marked official public boundaries with remarkable precision. One afternoon, I watched two surveyors carefully uncover an old brass property monument that had been buried beneath years of grass and decorative landscaping. The marker had never moved. People's assumptions had. News traveled quickly through Cedar Ridge estates. At first, rumors spread faster than verified information. Some residents believed the state planned to close the public dock. Others insisted the homeowners association had been unfairly targeted. Then the official letters arrived. Every property owner received a detailed notice explaining the legal boundaries surrounding Cedar Hollow Lake, the purpose of the protected public easements, and the importance of maintaining unobstructed access for lawful recreational use. The confusion that had lingered for years began disappearing almost overnight. A special homeowners association meeting was scheduled the following Tuesday evening. I had no intention of attending until one of my neighbors, Mrs. Collins, stopped by the cabin carrying a homemade apple pie and gently suggested I should be there. "Not to argue," she said with a warm smile. "Just so people can finally hear the truth from someone who actually knows this lake." The meeting took place inside the subdivision clubhouse overlooking the water. Folding chairs filled every corner of the room. Conversations that had once been whispered now happened openly. Copies of official survey maps rested on nearly every table. Representatives from the State Land Management Office patiently explained the recorded easements, while wildlife officers answered questions about fishing regulations, shoreline access, and conservation responsibilities. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody needed to. Every answer pointed back to the same recorded documents, the same maps, and the same laws that had quietly existed for generations. Several residents admitted they had honestly believed the signs were legitimate because they had been there for years. Others expressed frustration that visiting friends and relatives had been turned away from places they had every legal right to enjoy. Karen remained unusually quiet throughout the meeting. The certainty that had once filled every sentence she spoke had been replaced by careful listening. Near the end of the evening, the association board voted to remove every unauthorized sign immediately and to coordinate future shoreline projects directly with state agencies before making any changes affecting public access. Volunteers signed up to help replace confusing notices with accurate informational signs, explaining both conservation rules and public recreation rights. As the meeting ended, families gathered around the large survey map displayed near the entrance. Parents pointed toward fishing docks while children traced hiking trails with excited fingers. Watching them reminded me that the real victory had never been about proving one person wrong. It was about restoring something far more valuable than pride. It was about giving the community back a shared understanding that public lands are not protected by the loudest voice in the room. They are protected by honest stewardship, clear laws, and people willing to respect both. About a month later, I found myself standing on the very same dock just before sunrise, holding the same old enamel coffee mug, breathing in the familiar mix of freshwater, pine, and cool morning air that had greeted me for years. Some things had changed, though. The unauthorized signs were gone. In their place stood clean, professionally installed information boards carrying the official state emblem, clearly explaining fishing regulations, public access rights, conservation guidelines, and simple reminders to leave the shoreline better than you found it. Families no longer hesitated at the entrance, wondering whether they belonged there. They simply parked, unloaded their gear, smiled at one another, and walked toward the water. The atmosphere felt lighter, not because the lake had changed, but because uncertainty had finally disappeared. A father stood beside his daughter only a few yards away, patiently showing her how to thread fishing line through the guides on her very first spinning rod. She looked no older than 8. Every few seconds, she asked another question, and he answered each one with the same patience my own father had shown me decades earlier. Watching them brought back memories I had not thought about in years. I quietly walked over and offered the little girl one of my extra bobbers after noticing hers had cracked against the dock. Her eyes lit up as though I had handed her something priceless. Her father thanked me, and we talked for a few minutes about water temperature, local fish, and the best places to cast during early summer mornings. Before long, the little girl made her first cast. It landed only 15 feet from the dock, nowhere near the fallen timber where the fish usually gathered, but she smiled anyway. Sometimes joy has nothing to do with perfect technique. About 20 minutes later, her bobber disappeared beneath the surface. The surprise on her face was followed by laughter that echoed across the quiet lake. Her father helped her reel in a small bluegill, carefully removing the hook before lowering the fish gently back into the water. I could not help smiling. That single moment reminded me why public access matters more than arguments over boundaries or pride. It creates memories that outlast every meeting, every misunderstanding, and every temporary disagreement. As I packed away a few empty coffee cups left behind by earlier visitors, I noticed someone approaching slowly along the trail. It was Karen. She wore jeans, hiking shoes, and a simple blue windbreaker instead of the polished outfit she usually favored. She stopped several feet away, looking out across the lake before speaking. "Good morning, Ethan." Her voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. I nodded. "Morning." For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. The breeze rustled the tall grass along the shoreline, while a pair of ducks glided silently through the reflection of the rising sun. Finally, she looked toward the public access sign and gave a small, thoughtful smile. "I spent a long time believing I was protecting this place," she admitted. "I never realized I was making it smaller." I looked across the water before answering. "The lake has always been big enough for everyone willing to respect it." She slowly nodded. "I understand that now." There was no dramatic apology, no angry confrontation, no audience waiting to applaud. Just two people standing beside the same water, looking at the same sunrise, with a better understanding than either conversation or conflict could have forced. Before leaving, Karen reached into her pocket and handed me a folded flyer. The Homeowners Association had partnered with the State Conservation Office to organize a volunteer shoreline cleanup and native plant restoration weekend open to every resident and every visitor. At the bottom, in smaller print, were the words, "Working together to protect the lake we all share." I smiled as I folded the paper and slipped it into my tackle bag. A few weeks later, dozens of volunteers planted native grasses, collected litter, repaired bird nesting boxes, and restored sections of shoreline that had slowly eroded over the years. Children learned how wetlands filter water. Teenagers helped build fish habitat structures. Retirees shared stories about what the lake looked like half a century earlier. The wildlife officers stopped by that afternoon, not because someone had called with another complaint, but simply to thank everyone for their work. Before leaving, Officer Daniels walked over, shook my hand once again, and quietly said, "This is exactly what public lands are supposed to do. They bring people together." As I watched the sunlight dance across Cedar Hollow Lake one last time that evening, I realized the greatest victory had never been proving I had the right to fish. The greatest victory was watching an entire community rediscover that respect grows stronger than control, truth lasts longer than assumptions, and the law exists not to keep good people apart, but to make sure places like this remain open for every generation that has not yet cast its very first line.